Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Thaddeus Pike had been working the morning shift at Rosewood Crematorium for exactly 3 years. During that time, he had developed a routine so flawless it could almost be set by the clock. Every morning at 6, he clocked in, unlocked the preparation room, reviewed the intake logs, and carefully compared the documents for the bodies delivered the previous night. He had learned early on that cremation was a job that allowed no mistakes. Because in this work, precision was everything. Families wanted to know that the ashes they received truly belonged to their loved ones and had not been mixed with anyone else's. A body, a chamber, an urn. This seemingly simple equation was almost a sacred rule for him. And if this rule was broken even once, it wasn't just the dignity of the job that was lost, but also the last shred of peace a grieving family hoped to find. The body had arrived at 11:30 the previous night, logged by the evening attendant whose handwriting Thaddeus had learned to decipher over countless intake forms. Male, mid-50s, discovered in his apartment after neighbors reported a smell. Natural causes, pending autopsy. The tag clipped to the black body bag read Immersive 4477, and Thaddeus had performed this verification routine so many times he could do it half asleep. He unzipped the bag just far enough to see the identification bracelet on the corpse's wrist, compared the number to the paperwork, initialed both documents, and re-zipped the bag. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual. The body would go into the retort at 9 a.m. after the family's brief viewing at 8:30. But at 6:45, while Thaddeus was drinking his first coffee of the morning in the small office adjacent to the preparation room, he heard something that made him freeze mid-sip. A sound, faint, rhythmic, coming from the cold storage area where body number 44477 waited on its gurney. At first, he thought it was the ventilation system, that low mechanical hum that pervaded every funeral home and crematorium he'd ever worked in. But this was different. This had a wet quality to it, organic, like air, moving through a partially blocked passage. He set down his coffee and walked to the doorway, listening. There it was again. Definitely coming from cold storage. Thaddeus felt his pulse quicken, felt that old familiar tightness in his chest that he'd thought he'd outgrown after 3 years of working with the dead. He'd seen bodies do strange things. He'd watched them sit up when rigor mortis released. He'd heard gases escape with sounds that could pass for speech. He'd seen limbs shift position, fingers curl, eyelids flutter. All explainable, all documented phenomena. The dead didn't come back to life, but their bodies continued to change, continued to move through predictable biological processes. That's what he told himself as he pushed open the cold storage door. The room was kept at 38 degrees, cold enough to slow decomposition, but not cold enough to freeze tissue. 3 gurneys lined the wall, but only one was occupied. Body number 4477 lay exactly where the night attendant had left it. The black bag zipped shut, the toe tag dangling from the corner of the gurney. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked wrong. But the sound continued, and now that Thaddeus was in the room, he could pinpoint its location. It was coming from inside the body bag. A rhythmic whisper of movement, steady as a heartbeat. In, out, in, out. He approached the gurney slowly, his hand reaching for the zipper pull. Part of him wanted to walk away, to call his supervisor to let someone else deal with whatever was happening. But he'd been doing this job for 3 years. He was the morning shift supervisor. This was his responsibility. He pulled the zipper down 6 inches, then 12, then far enough that he could see the corpse's face and chest. And then he saw it. The chest was moving, rising and falling, as if the dead man were breathing. Thaddeus stumbled backward, his hand still gripping the zipper. His rational mind scrambled for an explanation. Gas buildup in the abdominal cavity could create pressure that moved the diaphragm. Remaining air in the lungs could shift position, could create the illusion of breath. But this wasn't an illusion. This was sustained, rhythmic movement, exactly like breathing, continuing right in front of his eyes. He counted 7 breaths per minute. Slow, deep, regular. The kind of breathing pattern you'd see in someone sleeping, not in someone who'd been dead for 16 hours. He forced himself to move closer, to place his hand on the corpse's chest. The skin was cold, refrigerator cold, with the slight waxy texture that formaldehyde-free embalming left behind. No pulse, no warmth, no sign of life. But under his palm he could feel it, the chest rising, the ribs expanding, the sternum lifting. He pulled his hand back and watched. The breathing continued. The dead man's face remained slack, eyes half open and clouded, mouth slightly ajar. No other movement, no twitch of the fingers, no flutter of the eyelids. Just the chest, rising and falling, rising and falling. Thaddeus's phone was in his back pocket. He could call Dr. Morrison, the medical examiner who'd signed the death certificate. He could call his supervisor. He could call someone, anyone, to witness what he was seeing. But what would he say? That a dead body was breathing? They'd think he'd lost his mind. They'd send him home, maybe suggest he take some time off, maybe question whether he was fit for the job. And then what would happen to the body? What would happen to the family who'd be arriving in less than 2 hours expecting closure? He stood there for 5 full minutes, watching the chest rise and fall, counting the breaths, trying to find any other explanation. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The chest settled, deflated, and went still. Thaddeus waited, counting seconds in his head, waiting for it to start again. 60 seconds. 90. 2 minutes. Nothing. The body was still, completely still the way a corpse should be. He reached out one more time, placed his palm against the sternum, and felt nothing. No movement, no breath, no sign of the rhythmic expansion he'd just witnessed. He zipped the body bag shut, his hands shaking slightly, and walked out of cold storage. In the office, he pulled up the surveillance footage. The crematorium had 3 cameras, one covering the intake area, one covering the preparation room, and one covering the retort chamber. There was no camera in cold storage, a deliberate choice to preserve dignity. But the cold storage door was visible in the preparation room camera feed. He scrolled back to midnight, when the evening attendant had logged out, and began watching at double speed. Nothing. No one had entered the crematorium between midnight and his arrival at 6 a.m. The building had been completely empty. He scrolled to 6:30, when he'd been in the office, and watched himself walk to the cold storage door, stand there listening, then push it open. He watched himself disappear into the room for 6 minutes, then emerge looking shaken. From the camera's perspective, nothing unusual had happened. Just a normal morning, a normal routine. The camera couldn't see what had happened inside cold storage. It had no way of recording the impossible thing he'd witnessed. At 7:45, Thaddeus made his decision. He would proceed as planned. The family would have their viewing, brief and private in the small chapel adjacent to the crematorium. Then he would perform the cremation. Body number 44477 would be reduced to ash and bone fragments, processed and placed in the urn the family had selected. Everything would proceed according to protocol, and he would tell no one what he'd seen, because what he'd seen couldn't have happened, and saying it out loud would only create problems that had no solutions. The family arrived at 8:30. 3 people: an older woman with silver hair, a middle-aged man who shared the deceased's strong jawline, and a younger woman who kept her eyes fixed on the floor as they walked through the entrance. Thaddeus greeted them with the practiced sympathy he'd perfected over 3 years, offered his condolences, and guided them to the small viewing room where he'd positioned body number 44477 on a cloth-covered table. The body bag had been replaced with a simple white shroud that covered everything except the face. That was what the family had requested. Just the face. Just enough to say goodbye. The older woman approached first, and Thaddeus watched her face carefully, looking for any sign that she noticed something wrong. But she just stood there, one hand covering her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. The man put his arm around her shoulders. The younger woman stayed back near the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. They stood in silence for several minutes, and then the older woman reached out and touched the dead man's cheek. Her hand lingered there for a moment, and then she nodded to Thaddeus. That was the signal. They were finished. They were ready to let go. Thaddeus guided them back to the entrance, provided them with the paperwork they'd need to collect the ashes in 3 days, and watched them leave. Through the window, he could see them standing in the parking lot, the older woman leaning against the man, all 3 of them crying. He felt the weight of what he was about to do settle over him. In 30 minutes, the body they'd just touched, just said goodbye to, would be inside the retort. In 4 hours, it would be ash. Whatever strange phenomenon he'd witnessed that morning would be erased, incinerated, made irrelevant by 2,000 degrees of heat. He returned to the preparation room and wheeled the gurney to the retort loading area. The retort door was already open, preheated to operating temperature. He could feel the heat from 6 feet away, could see the air shimmer and distort above the opening. He positioned the gurney parallel to the loading track and prepared to transfer the body. This part of the process was always solemn, always deliberate. He never rushed it. Even though the family was gone, even though no one was watching, he treated each body with the same careful respect. That's what separated a professional from someone just doing a job. He pulled back the white shroud, revealing the body in its entirety. The man was dressed in the clothes he'd died in, jeans and a button-down shirt, now wrinkled and stained. Thaddeus positioned the cardboard cremation tray beside the gurney, and then carefully, supporting the head and shoulders, he transferred the body onto the tray. The weight was substantial, dead weight, the kind that made your back ache if you weren't careful about your lifting technique. When the body was centered on the tray, he folded the arms across the chest and positioned the legs straight. Standard cremation posture. Dignified. Respectful. He was reaching for the loading controls when he felt it. A warmth against his forearm, exactly where it had been resting against the corpse's chest. Not the ambient heat from the retort, this was different. Localized, specific. He pulled his arm back and stared at the chest. Nothing. No movement, no breath, no sign of anything unusual. The body lay exactly as he'd positioned it, still and cold. But the warmth lingered on his skin, a phantom sensation that made the hair on his arms stand up. He activated the loading mechanism. The motorized track engaged with a low mechanical hum, and the cardboard tray began to slide toward the retort opening. Slowly, smoothly, the body moved forward, feet first, into the glowing chamber. Thaddeus watched, his hand on the control panel ready to stop the process if anything went wrong. The feet entered the chamber, then the legs, then the torso. And then, just as the shoulders crossed the threshold, the body jerked. Not a small movement, not a settling or shifting. The entire torso convulsed upward, the back arching, the arms flinging outward, the head snapping back. The movement was so violent, so sudden that the cardboard tray buckled. Thaddeus slammed his hand down on the emergency stop button. The loading mechanism ground to a halt with a metallic screech. The body was half in, half out of the retort, the upper body inside the chamber, the legs still on the track outside. For several seconds, Thaddeus couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at the impossible thing that had just happened. Then training took over. He grabbed the manual release lever and pulled, disengaging the motorized track. He gripped the edge of the cardboard tray and pulled backward, dragging the body out of the retort chamber. The heat was intense, almost unbearable, and his hands screamed in protest. But he kept pulling until the entire body was clear of the opening. He stepped back, gasping, his hands red and throbbing. The body lay on the buckled tray, positioned exactly as it had been before. Arms across the chest, legs straight, face peaceful. No sign that it had just arched violently upward, no sign that anything unusual had happened at all. Except the tray. The cardboard was bent, creased down the center where the spine had pressed against it with enough force to buckle the material. Thaddeus stood there, his mind racing. Bodies moved in the retort all the time. The heat caused muscles to contract, tendons to snap, gases to expand. It was called the pugilistic posture, the way a body would draw up into a fighting stance as it burned. But that happened inside the chamber, after exposure to extreme heat. It didn't happen on the loading track. It didn't happen before cremation even began, and it definitely didn't happen with enough force to buckle a reinforced cardboard tray. He checked the surveillance camera, the one that covered the retort area. The angle was wrong. It showed the control panel and the retort door, but not the loading track itself. It wouldn't have captured what he'd just seen, just like the cold storage camera hadn't captured the breathing. There was no evidence, no proof, nothing he could show to anyone that would make them believe him. Just his word against the impossible. He looked at the clock. 9:20. He was already behind schedule. Another body was due for cremation at 11, and he still had to process this one. He couldn't leave it sitting here, couldn't delay indefinitely. The family was expecting ashes in 3 days. Other families were counting on him to maintain the schedule, to ensure their loved ones were treated with dignity and respect. He had a job to do, and personal discomfort, personal fear, couldn't be allowed to interfere. He replaced the buckled cardboard tray with a new one, transferred the body again, and positioned it on the loading track. This time, he didn't touch the corpse any longer than necessary. He used the mechanical gurney lift to move it, kept his hands on metal and cardboard, avoided any direct contact with the body itself. When everything was in position, he took a deep breath and activated the loading mechanism again. The tray slid forward. Feet, legs, torso, shoulders. Thaddeus watched, his finger hovering over the emergency stop button, waiting for another jerk, another convulsion. But nothing happened. The body slid smoothly into the retort chamber, disappearing into the bright orange glow. When it was fully inside, he closed the door, engaged the locking mechanism, and activated the cremation cycle. The retort roared to life, the burners igniting with a deep whoosh of flame. Through the observation window, Thaddeus could see the body inside, a dark silhouette against the intense light. He stood there watching, something he didn't usually do. Normally, he'd activate the cycle and walk away, return to the office to do paperwork while the process ran its course. But today he stayed. He needed to see this through, needed to watch the body burn, needed to confirm that it would stay in the chamber, that it wouldn't somehow get out. 20 minutes into the cycle, he saw the first major change. The clothing caught fire, burning away quickly, exposing the skin beneath. 30 minutes in, the skin began to blacken and split. 45 minutes in, the body began to contract. The arms drawing up, the legs bending, the back arching into that classic pugilistic posture. All normal, all expected. The body was burning the way it was supposed to burn. But then he noticed something else. Something in the pattern of the flames. They seemed to be moving in a specific way, swirling around the body in a circular motion rather than consuming it evenly. He moved closer to the observation window, squinting against the brightness. The flames were definitely behaving strangely, almost like they were avoiding the chest area, like they were burning everything around it, but leaving that central region untouched. He checked the temperature gauge. 1900 degrees. Well within normal range. He checked the oxygen flow. Normal. Everything was functioning correctly. There was no mechanical reason for the uneven burn pattern. He watched for another 10 minutes and gradually the anomaly corrected itself. The flames spread across the entire body, consuming it evenly, reducing it to the white-hot bones that would eventually become ash. 2 hours into the cycle, his phone rang. It was the office administrator calling to confirm the schedule for the 11 o'clock cremation. Thaddeus told her everything was on track. Body number 477 would be complete by 10:30, which would give him 30 minutes to process the remains and prepare for the next one. She thanked him and hung up. He returned his attention to the observation window. The body was almost gone now, reduced to skeletal fragments glowing white in the heat. Another hour and the cycle would be complete. At 10:45, he opened the retort door and let the chamber cool. It took 30 minutes for the temperature to drop enough that he could safely rake the remains onto the processing tray. He worked carefully, using the long metal rake to pull the bone fragments forward, checking the chamber thoroughly to make sure he'd collected everything. The cremated remains looked normal. White and gray fragments, pieces of long bone, sections of skull, all the expected components of a complete cremation. He transferred them to the cremulator, the machine that would grind them into fine ash, and activated the cycle. While the cremulator ran, he cleaned the retort chamber, removing any residue, preparing it for the next body. The work was meditative, repetitive, and it helped calm his nerves. By the time he finished, the cremulator had completed its cycle. He opened it and looked inside. Fine ash, uniform in texture, exactly what it should be. He transferred it to the temporary container and sealed it with the label marked number 4477. In 3 days, the family would return, and he would transfer these ashes to the urn they'd selected. The process would be complete. The body that had breathed, that had jerked violently on the loading track, would be nothing more than 5 pounds of processed remains. He was labeling the container when he noticed something odd. There was ash on the counter beside the cremulator. Just a small amount, maybe a tablespoon, but he was always careful about containment. He never spilled. He used a small brush to sweep the ash into a paper envelope, intending to add it to the container, and that's when he saw the pattern. The ash had arranged itself on the counter in a specific shape, not random, not scattered. 4 numbers. 4477. Thaddeus stared at it, his hand frozen mid-sweep. The ash had formed the body's identification number. The same number that was on the intake tag, on the paperwork, on the label he'd just affixed to the container. He looked around the preparation room, searching for an explanation. Had he spilled ash earlier and not noticed? Had he somehow unconsciously arranged it into this pattern? But he'd been nowhere near the counter. He'd gone straight from the cremulator to the container, and the counter had been clean when he started. He swept the ash into the envelope, added it to the container, and sealed it again. His hands were shaking. He needed to get out of this room, needed to take a break, needed to breathe air that didn't smell like smoke and chemicals. He walked to the office, sat down at the desk and put his head in his hands. 3 years he'd been doing this job. 3 years of handling the dead, of operating the retort, of processing remains. Nothing like this had ever happened. Bodies didn't breathe. They didn't jerk violently. They didn't leave messages in ash. At 11:15, the next body arrived. Thaddeus met the transport driver at the loading dock, verified the paperwork, and wheeled the gurney to cold storage. This one was an elderly woman, died peacefully in her sleep at a nursing home. Natural causes, full cremation services scheduled for tomorrow. He logged her in, assigned her a number, numbered 4478, and positioned the gurney next to where 4477 had been that morning. He was walking back to the office when he heard it again. That sound, faint, rhythmic, coming from cold storage. He stopped, his hand on the doorframe, listening. It was the same sound he'd heard that morning, breathing. Slow, steady breathing. But this time, he couldn't tell which gurney it was coming from. The sound seemed to fill the entire room, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He pulled out his phone and called his supervisor, told him he wasn't feeling well, asked if someone could cover the rest of his shift. His supervisor agreed, told him to go home, to rest, that he'd find someone to handle the 11 o'clock cremation. Thaddeus thanked him, gathered his things, and walked out to his truck. He sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, staring at the crematorium building, listening to the sound of his own breathing, wondering if this was how it started. Wondering if the bodies he cremated were somehow aware, somehow conscious, trapped inside dead flesh and waiting for the fire to set them free. He started the engine and drove home, but he couldn't stop thinking about body number 44477. Couldn't stop seeing that chest rising and falling. Couldn't stop feeling that warmth against his arm. Couldn't stop seeing those numbers arranged in ash on the counter. When he got home, he opened his laptop and searched the intake records. He needed to know more about the man he'd cremated. Needed to know if there was something unusual about his death, something that might explain what had happened. The records were sparse. Name withheld for privacy. Age 54. Found deceased in apartment. No signs of foul play. Medical examiner had noted lividity patterns consistent with approximately 16 hours post-mortem. Cause of death listed as probable cardiac arrest, pending toxicology. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain spontaneous breathing, violent movement, or ash arranging itself into numbers. But there was one more detail, buried in the notes section. The deceased had been found lying on his back, arms across his chest, positioned as if already prepared for burial. The apartment superintendent who discovered him had commented on it, said it looked like the man had laid himself out, like he'd known he was dying and had prepared himself for it, like he'd arranged his own body for whatever came next. Thaddeus closed the laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the silence of his empty house. He thought about going back tomorrow, about continuing his job, about wheeling more bodies into cold storage and loading them into the retort. He thought about the sounds he might hear, the movements he might see, the messages he might find written in ash, and he wondered if he could keep doing this, keep working in that space between life and death, keep touching bodies that weren't quite ready to let go. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his supervisor. Just wanted to let you know, the 11 o'clock went fine. Everything normal. The replacement guy said cold storage was quiet, no issues. Hope you feel better tomorrow. Thaddeus read the message 3 times. Everything normal. Cold storage was quiet. No breathing sounds. No movements. Whatever had happened with body number 4477, whatever strange phenomenon he'd witnessed, had been specific to that one corpse. That one man who'd arranged himself for death, who'd laid himself out like he knew exactly what was coming, and had accepted it. But that didn't make Thaddeus feel better, because if it had happened once, it could happen again. The next body, or the one after that, or the one after that. And what if next time the body didn't stop breathing? What if next time it didn't stay in the retort? What if next time, when he opened cold storage, the gurney was empty and the body bag was unzipped from the inside? He didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about body number 477 burning in the retort, thinking about those flames swirling around the chest, avoiding it, circling it, like they were afraid to touch whatever was inside, thinking about the ash forming numbers, spelling out an identification tag that should have meant nothing, should have been just an administrative detail, but had somehow become important enough that the dead wanted to write it down, wanted to leave it behind as a message or a warning or a reminder. The next morning, Thaddeus called his supervisor and told him he wasn't coming in. He needed a few days, needed to clear his head, needed to decide if he could continue doing this work. His supervisor understood, told him to take all the time he needed, that grief work was hard, that burnout was common, that there was no shame in stepping away for a while. But it wasn't burnout, it was knowledge. The knowledge that something existed in that space between life and death, something that didn't want to let go, something that held on even as the body shut down, even as the flesh cooled and stiffened, even as the fire consumed it. Something that breathed when it shouldn't breathe, that moved when it shouldn't move, that wrote messages in ash when there was no one left to hold the pen. 3 days later, body number 477's family came to collect the ashes. Thaddeus wasn't there, but his supervisor called him afterward to tell him how it had gone. The family had been grateful, had said the viewing had given them closure, had thanked the staff for treating their father with dignity and respect. They'd taken the urn and left, satisfied that everything had been handled properly, that their loved one was at peace. Thaddeus thanked his supervisor for the update and hung up. He sat in his living room, looking out the window at the afternoon light, and he wondered what peace meant for the dead. Wondered if that man was truly at peace now, reduced to ash, scattered or buried or placed on a mantle somewhere. Or if some part of him was still there, still aware, still trying to breathe, still trying to move, still trying to write his identification number in whatever material he could find, trying desperately to prove that he still existed, that he was still there, that he hadn't quite let go yet. Thaddeus never went back to work at Rosewood Crematorium. He called a week later and resigned, told his supervisor that he'd found a different line of work, thanked him for the opportunity, wished him well. He didn't explain why, didn't mention the breathing or the movement or the ash. What would be the point? No one would believe him. And even if they did, what could they do about it? Stop cremating bodies. Start checking for signs of consciousness in corpses. There was no protocol for this, no procedure, no solution. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and he's lying in bed waiting for sleep that won't come, he thinks about body number 477. He thinks about that chest rising and falling, about those arms flinging outward, about those numbers written in ash. And he wonders if the man is still there, still trying to breathe, still trying to move, still trying to tell someone that he isn't quite gone yet, that some part of him remains, trapped in the ashes, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to understand, waiting for someone to set him free. But Thaddeus can't go back, can't face that cold storage room again, can't wheel another body into the retort, can't stand at the observation window and watch the flames do their work, wondering if somewhere in that inferno, something is still aware, still conscious, still desperately trying to hold on to the last shreds of existence. He can't do it, he won't do it, so he finds other work, simple work. Work that doesn't involve death or fire, or the terrible space between being alive and being gone. Work that lets him sleep at night without seeing those numbers written in ash. without hearing that slow, steady breathing, without feeling that warmth against his arm where a dead man's chest rose and fell, rose and fell, rose and fell, long after it should have been still forever. Merritt Glover had been working night security at Pine Haven Memorial Services for 7 months, and the job had settled into a comfortable monotony that he'd come to appreciate. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week, walking the empty hallways with a flashlight and a radio, checking doors, monitoring the camera feeds, making sure nothing disturbed the silence that death required. The building was old, built in 1952, with thick walls and narrow windows that kept the sound out and the cool air in. During the day it was full of people and flowers and quiet grief, but at night it belonged to him and to the bodies waiting in cold storage for their turn in the preparation rooms or the cremation chamber. The security office was a small room near the main entrance, barely large enough for a desk, 2 monitors, and a chair that squeaked every time Merritt shifted his weight. The monitors displayed feeds from 6 cameras positioned throughout the building. Main entrance, rear loading dock, preparation room, cremation chamber, hallway junction, and viewing room 3. Merritt had learned to read the feeds the way some people read books, understanding the story each empty room was telling. The preparation room with its stainless steel tables gleaming under fluorescent lights. The cremation chamber with its heavy door sealed shut for the night. The viewing room with its rows of chairs facing a raised platform where caskets were positioned for final goodbyes. It was viewing room 3 that caught his attention that night, a Tuesday in late October, when the first frost had settled on the parking lot and the building's heating system was making its usual groaning sounds as it struggled to maintain temperature. Merritt had been doing his midnight walkthrough, checking each room physically, even though the cameras showed them empty, when he returned to the office and glanced at the monitors. And there, in viewing room 3, sitting in the 3rd row of chairs, was a woman. He leaned forward, his eyes focusing on the screen. The image was grainy, black and white, the way all surveillance footage looked, but there was no mistaking what he was seeing. A woman in dark clothing, sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, facing the empty platform at the front of the room. He looked at the timestamp in the corner of the screen. 12:17 a.m. He'd been in that room less than 10 minutes ago, had walked through it with his flashlight, had checked the doors and windows, had confirmed it was empty and secured. His first thought was that someone from a viewing earlier that day had hidden in the building, had waited for it to close, had come back to spend more time with their deceased loved one. It happened occasionally, though usually security caught them before they got this far. Grieving people did desperate things, made irrational choices, and part of his job was to handle these situations with compassion while still enforcing the rules. No one was allowed in the building after hours. No one except staff. He grabbed his radio and his flashlight and walked quickly down the hallway toward the viewing room 3. The building was quiet, except for the sound of his footsteps on the tile floor and the distant hum of the HVAC system. He reached the viewing room and pushed open the door, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Empty, completely empty. Rows of chairs, all vacant. Platform at the front, bare. No woman, no movement, no sign that anyone had been there. Merritt stood in the doorway, sweeping his flashlight across the room methodically. Left to right, front to back, checking every corner, every shadow. Nothing. He walked to the 3rd row, the exact spot where he'd seen the woman sitting on the monitor. The chair looked undisturbed. He placed his hand on the seat, feeling for warmth, for any indication that someone had been there recently. The fabric was cold, the same temperature as everything else in the room. He checked the windows, locked from the inside. He checked the small storage closet at the back of the room. Empty except for spare chairs and a folding table. There was no way someone could have left the room in the 30 seconds it had taken him to walk from the office. No rear door, no alternative exit. The only way out was through the door he'd just come through, and he would have seen anyone leaving. He walked back to the office, his mind working through possibilities. A trick of the light, maybe. The camera positioned in viewing room 3 was old, installed when the building was renovated in '98, and sometimes shadows could create shapes that looked like human figures. Or maybe he'd been more tired than he realized. Had dozed off for a moment at the desk and dreamed the image he'd seen. 7 months of night shifts could do strange things to a person's perception, could blur the line between waking and sleeping. But when he sat down at the desk and looked at the monitor again, she was still there. Same position, same chair, same perfect stillness. The timestamp now read 12:23 a.m. Merritt felt his pulse accelerate, felt that uncomfortable tightness in his chest that came with seeing something that contradicted everything his rational mind believed was possible. He stared at the screen, watching for any movement, any sign that would tell him this was a technical glitch, a recording error, something explainable. The woman didn't move. She sat there, hands folded, facing forward, as if watching something on the platform that Merritt couldn't see. He reached for his radio, considered calling the night manager who handled cremations and lived 10 minutes away. But what would he say? That he was seeing a person on the monitor who wasn't actually in the room. They'd think he was losing it. That the isolation of night work was getting to him. That maybe he needed to be reassigned to day shift or given some time off. He decided to try something different. He pulled out his phone and opened the camera app. He positioned it in front of the monitor, framing the image of viewing room 3 with the woman sitting in the 3rd row, and he took a photograph. The phone's camera captured the image clearly. The monitor, the timestamp, the rows of chairs, and the dark figure sitting motionless in the 3rd row. At least he had proof now. Proof that he wasn't imagining this, that the image was there on the screen regardless of what was actually in the room. He looked up from his phone to the monitor, and his breath caught. The woman had moved. She was no longer facing forward. Her head had turned, and now she was looking directly at the camera, directly at him. Even through the grainy black and white footage, even across the distance and through the electronic medium, he could feel her gaze. It was focused, intentional, like she knew exactly where he was and what he was doing. Merritt pushed back from the desk, his chair rolling backward until it hit the wall. He stared at the monitor, unable to look away, unable to process what he was seeing. The woman remained in that position, her face turned toward the camera, and now he could make out more details. Dark hair, shoulder length, pale skin, a coat or jacket, dark-colored. She looked middle-aged, maybe 40s or 50s, though it was hard to tell from the footage. What was clear was that she was aware of the camera, aware that she was being watched, and she was staring back. His radio crackled with static, making him jump. He grabbed it, his hand shaking slightly, expecting a call from the night manager or maybe from the crematorium technician who sometimes worked late. But there was no voice, just a burst of white noise that lasted 3 seconds and then cut out. He set the radio back on the desk and forced himself to look at the monitor again. The woman was standing now. She'd risen from the chair and was walking toward the camera, walking down the aisle between the rows of seats, her movements smooth and purposeful. Merritt watched, paralyzed, as she approached. The camera was positioned in the upper corner of the room, mounted high on the wall, and as she got closer, her face tilted upward, maintaining eye contact with the lens. When she reached the front row, she stopped, and then she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, wasn't friendly or comforting. It was something else, something that made Merritt's skin crawl. It was knowing, like she understood something he didn't. like she was privy to a secret that he couldn't access. She stood there smiling at the camera for 10 seconds, 15, 20, and then she turned and walked toward the platform at the front of the room. She climbed the 3 steps leading up to it, and then she lay down, positioning herself exactly the way a body would be positioned in a casket. Arms crossed over her chest, legs straight, head centered, eyes closed. Merritt grabbed his flashlight and ran. He didn't think about it, didn't plan it, just moved on pure instinct. He burst through the office door and sprinted down the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the walls, his breath coming in short gasps. He reached viewing room 3 and threw the door open, his flashlight beam flooding the room with harsh white light. Empty. The platform was bare. The chairs were vacant. There was no woman, no body, no sign that anyone had been there. He climbed onto the platform, checking for warmth, for any indication that someone had been lying there moments ago. Nothing. The surface was cold and dust-free, undisturbed. He stood there, his chest heaving, his mind racing through impossible scenarios, trying to find one that made sense. He walked back to the office slowly this time, checking every room he passed, looking for any place someone could hide. The building remained empty, silent except for the sounds he was making. When he reached the office and looked at the monitor, viewing room 3 showed exactly what he'd just seen with his own eyes. Empty chairs, bare platform, no woman. But the timestamp was wrong. According to the monitor, it was 12:41 a.m. Merritt looked at his phone. 12:57 a.m., 16 minutes of discrepancy. He checked the other monitors, looking at their timestamps. Main entrance, 12:57 a.m. Loading dock, 12:57 a.m. Preparation room, 12:57 a.m. Cremation chamber, 12:57 a.m. Hallway junction, 12:57 a.m. Every camera showed the correct current time except viewing room 3, which remained frozen at 12:41 a.m. He tried to remember when he'd first seen the woman on the monitor. 12:17 a.m. 24 minutes before the camera had apparently stopped updating. So either the camera had malfunctioned, was now playing back recorded footage from earlier in the night, or something else was happening, something that didn't fit into any technical explanation he could think of. Merritt spent the rest of his shift sitting at the desk, watching that monitor. The image never changed. 12:41 a.m., empty room, chairs and platform exactly as they should be. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, that the answer was right there in front of him, but he was too close to see it. At 6 a.m., when the day shift arrived, he filed a maintenance request for the viewing room 3 camera. Technical malfunction, he wrote. Timestamp error and possible image playback issues. The day shift supervisor nodded, said they'd have someone look at it, thanked him for staying alert. Merritt drove home in the early morning light, exhausted but unable to sleep. He kept seeing that smile, that knowing expression on the woman's face as she'd looked into the camera. He kept seeing the way she'd climbed onto the platform and positioned herself like a corpse, like she was showing him something, demonstrating something he needed to understand. But what? What was the message? What was she trying to tell him? He slept fitfully that day, waking every few hours with fragments of dreams he couldn't quite remember. When his alarm went off at 8 p.m., he almost called in sick. Almost told them he needed a night off, needed to clear his head. But he didn't. He got dressed, made coffee, drove to Pine Haven Memorial Services and clocked in at 10 p.m. The day shift supervisor told him the maintenance technician had looked at the viewing room 3 camera, found nothing wrong. Timestamp was synchronized correctly now, image quality was fine, no technical issues detected. Must have been a temporary glitch. Merritt thanked him and settled into the office chair, his eyes immediately going to the monitor showing viewing room 3. Empty, as it should be. He watched it for the first hour of his shift, barely blinking, waiting to see if the woman would appear again. But the room remained empty, and eventually he forced himself to look away, to check the other monitors, to do the walkthrough he was supposed to do every 2 hours. At midnight, he was in the cremation chamber area, checking that the retort was properly secured for the night, when his radio crackled again. This time, there was a voice, faint and distorted, barely audible through the static. He couldn't make out the words, couldn't even tell if it was male or female, but there was definitely someone speaking. He pressed the transmit button and identified himself, asked who was calling. No response, just empty air. He completed his walkthrough and returned to the office. The monitors showed everything normal, main entrance secure, loading dock secure, preparation room empty, cremation chamber sealed, hallway junction clear, and viewing room 3. Viewing room 3 showed the woman again, but this time she wasn't sitting in the chairs. She was standing at the camera, so close that her face filled most of the frame. She was looking directly into the lens, her expression no longer smiling but serious, urgent, like she was trying to tell him something important. Merritt didn't run this time. He sat at the desk staring at the monitor, and he spoke out loud, even though he knew it was irrational. Knew that she couldn't hear him. "Who are you? What do you want?" The woman on the monitor didn't react, didn't change expression. She just stood there, face filling the screen, eyes locked on the camera, and then, slowly, she raised one hand and pointed. Not at the camera, not directly at him. She was pointing to her left, which would be to the right from the camera's perspective, toward the small storage closet at the back of the room. Merritt looked at his phone. Checked the time. 12:03 a.m. He took a screenshot of the monitor showing the woman's face and her pointing hand, creating another piece of evidence that this was really happening, that he wasn't losing his mind. Then he grabbed his flashlight and walked to viewing room 3 for the 3rd time that night. The room was empty when he opened the door. He went straight to the storage closet, the one he'd checked the night before, the one that had contained nothing but spare chairs and a folding table. He opened the door and shone his flashlight inside. At first, it looked the same, unchanged. But then he noticed something on the floor in the back corner, partially hidden behind one of the folded chairs. A small object, dark-colored, easy to miss in the shadows. He moved the chair aside and picked up the object. It was a wallet, old and worn, the leather cracked and faded. He opened it carefully. Inside was a driver's license expired, issued to a woman named Patricia Landry. The photo showed a middle-aged woman with shoulder-length dark hair and pale skin, the same woman he'd seen on the monitor. The license had expired 5 years ago. The birth date listed would make Patricia 62 years old now if she was still alive. There was nothing else in the wallet. No credit cards, no cash, no photos, just the license and a small card tucked into one of the slots. Merritt pulled it out and read it. It was a business card for Pine Haven Memorial Services with a date written on the back in faded ink. October 28, 2020. 5 years ago. He checked his phone. Today was October 29, 2025. He returned to the office and searched the computer system, looking for any record of Patricia Landry. The database went back 10 years, and he found her file quickly. Patricia Landry, deceased October 26, 2020. Services held October 28, 2020. Viewing in room 3. Cremation completed October 29, 2020, 5 years ago to the day. Merritt sat back in his chair, the wallet still in his hand. The woman on the monitor wasn't a living person who'd somehow gotten into the building. She was a recorded image, a fragment of the past bleeding through into the present. But why? Why was he seeing her now? Why was the camera showing him footage from 5 years ago as if it were happening in real time? He looked at the monitor. The image had changed again. No longer the close-up of Patricia's face. Now the camera showed the room as it had been 5 years ago during her viewing. The chairs were full of people, maybe 30 of them, all dressed in dark colors, all facing the platform where a casket sat surrounded by flowers. He could see Patricia in the casket, her face peaceful, her hands folded. And he could see the mourners, some crying, some stoic, some standing to approach the casket and pay their respects. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read October 28, 2020, 2:47 p.m. Merritt watched, transfixed, as the scene played out. He saw people approach the casket, saw them lean down and whisper things he couldn't hear, saw them place their hands on the polished wood. He saw a woman who looked like an older version of Patricia, maybe a sister or a mother, break down sobbing in the front row. He saw a man in a dark suit stand at the back of the room, separate from the others, watching the proceedings with an expression Merritt couldn't quite read. And then he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the third row, sitting alone while everyone else was clustered toward the front, was another figure. It was translucent, barely visible, but definitely there. A woman in dark clothing, her face turned toward the camera, looking directly at it, directly at him, across 5 years of time. And she was smiling that same, knowing smile. The image flickered, and suddenly it was back to the present. Empty room, vacant chairs, bare platform. The timestamp read 12:53 a.m., October 29, 2025. Merritt sat there, his hands gripping the edge of the desk, trying to understand what he'd just witnessed. Patricia Landry had been at her own viewing, somehow. Impossibly. She'd been there in that room 5 years ago, watching her own funeral, sitting among the mourners who couldn't see her, watching herself lie dead in a casket while some part of her remained aware, present, unable or unwilling to let go. His radio crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer. A woman's voice, soft but distinct. He took it. 3 words, followed by silence. Merritt grabbed the radio, his hands shaking. "Who took what? Patricia, is that you?" No response. Just empty static. He looked at the monitor again. The viewing room was no longer empty. Patricia stood in the center of the room, facing the camera, and she was pointing again. But this time she wasn't pointing to the storage closet. She was pointing to the platform, to the spot where her casket had been 5 years ago. And she was mouthing words, speaking silently, trying to tell him something he couldn't hear. Merritt left the office and walked to viewing room 3. When he opened the door, he half expected to see Patricia standing there, solid and real. But the room was empty. He climbed onto the platform and examined it carefully, running his hands over the surface looking for anything unusual. Nothing. It was just wood and fabric, worn from years of use but unremarkable. He was about to give up when his fingers caught on something at the back edge of the platform, tucked into the seam where the fabric met the wall. A small object wedged tightly into the gap. He worked it free carefully. It was a ring, gold, with a small diamond, a wedding ring. He held it up to his flashlight, examining it. The inside of the band was engraved with initials, P.L. and J.M. Patricia Landry, and someone with the initials J.M. Merritt returned to the office and searched the service records again, looking for more details about Patricia's viewing. He found the guest book, digitally scanned and stored in the system. He scrolled through the names, looking for someone with the initials J.M. There were 3. Jennifer Marston, sister. Robert Johnston, nephew. And James Merrick, listed without a relationship designation. He searched for James Merrick in the local property records, found an address 15 minutes away. Then he searched for James Merrick in the state court records and found something that made his stomach turn. James Merrick had been arrested 3 years ago for embezzlement. The victim was his employer, a small accounting firm where he'd worked for 8 years. He'd stolen over $200,000 over a period of 18 months, using it to pay off gambling debts. He'd served 14 months in prison and been released on probation. Merritt looked at the ring in his hand, turning it over, feeling the weight of it. Patricia Landry and James Merrick had been married, or engaged, or at least close enough that she'd given him a ring with their initials engraved inside. And at some point, before or after her death, that ring had ended up wedged into the platform in viewing room 3. Hidden, concealed, taken. He looked at the monitor. Patricia was still there, still pointing, but now her expression had changed. She looked satisfied, like he'd finally understood what she'd been trying to tell him, like he'd found what she needed him to find. And then, as he watched, she lowered her hand, turned away from the camera, and walked toward the platform. She climbed the steps, lay down in that familiar position, arms crossed over her chest, and closed her eyes. The image flickered one last time, and then viewing room 3 showed what it should show: an empty room with vacant chairs and a bare platform. The timestamp read 1:15 a.m., October 29th, 2025. Current time, current date. Patricia was gone. The camera was working normally again. Merritt sat in the office for the rest of his shift, the ring and the wallet on the desk in front of him. When the day shift arrived at 6 a.m., he filed a report about finding lost property in viewing room 3. He described the wallet and the ring, listed Patricia Landry's information from the license, and suggested that someone contact her next of kin to return the items. The day shift supervisor thanked him, said they'd handle it, asked if he'd had a quiet night otherwise. Merritt said yes. Quiet night. Nothing unusual. Just the normal sounds of an empty building and the steady glow of monitors showing empty rooms. He didn't mention the woman he'd seen on the camera. Didn't mention the footage from 5 years ago, or the voice on the radio, or the way Patricia had pointed him toward the evidence she'd left behind. What would be the point? No one would believe him, and besides, he'd done what she needed him to do. He'd found the ring. He'd uncovered the theft. The rest would work itself out. 2 weeks later, Merritt saw a small article in the local newspaper. Jennifer Marston, sister of the late Patricia Landry, had filed a civil suit against James Merrick for theft of property. According to the article, Patricia had loaned Merrick her wedding ring from her first marriage as collateral for a personal loan. When she died suddenly of a heart attack, Merrick claimed the ring had been lost. But an anonymous tip had led to its recovery, and now Patricia's family was seeking its return along with damages for emotional distress. Merritt cut out the article and kept it in his wallet, a reminder of the night he'd seen something impossible, the night he'd watched a dead woman guide him toward a truth that only she had known. He continued working night security at Pine Haven Memorial Services, continued monitoring the cameras, and walking the empty hallways and checking the doors and windows. The viewing room 3 camera never malfunctioned again. It showed exactly what it was supposed to show. Empty chairs, bare platforms, rooms waiting for the next viewing, the next family, the next goodbye. But sometimes, late in his shift when the building was at its quietest, Merritt would look at that monitor and remember. He'd remember Patricia standing at the camera, pointing, trying to communicate across the barrier that separated the living from the dead. He'd remember her smile, that knowing expression that said she understood something he was only beginning to grasp. That death wasn't always an ending. That sometimes the dead remained, lingering in the places where they'd said their final goodbyes, waiting for someone to see them, waiting for someone to hear them, waiting for someone to help them finish the business they'd left undone. He never saw Patricia again, but he started paying closer attention to the monitors, started noticing small anomalies that he'd previously dismissed as technical glitches. A shadow in the hallway that didn't quite match the lighting. A door that appeared open on one camera but closed on another. Timestamps that drifted by a few seconds before syncing back up. Nothing as dramatic as Patricia's appearance. Nothing that demanded his attention the way she had, but enough to make him wonder what else might be happening in the building when he wasn't looking. What other fragments of the past might be bleeding through into the present. And sometimes, when he was doing his midnight walkthrough, he'd pause outside viewing room 3 and listen. Not for sounds exactly, but for something else. A presence, a weight in the air, a sense that he wasn't quite alone. He never heard anything he could identify or explain. Just the normal sounds of an old building settling, the HVAC system running, the distant hum of refrigeration units in cold storage. But he felt something, and he'd learned to trust that feeling, learned to acknowledge it without fear. Because Patricia had taught him something important that night. She'd taught him that the dead weren't always gone, that they sometimes remained in the places that had mattered to them, watching, waiting, trying to communicate with the living in whatever ways they could manage. And she'd taught him that his job was more than just monitoring cameras and checking doors. His job was to pay attention, to notice the things that others missed, to be present for the moments when the barrier thinned and the dead reached out across it, desperate to finish what they'd started, desperate to find someone who would listen. So he listened, and he watched, and he waited. Because he knew now that death wasn't a door that closed forever. Sometimes it was more like a window, and sometimes the dead pressed their faces against the glass, looking back at the world they'd left behind, trying to catch the attention of anyone who might see them, anyone who might help them complete the tasks they'd left unfinished. And Merritt had decided that he would be that person. He would be the one who saw them, who heard them, who helped them when he could. It was the least he could do. After all, they were all going to end up on the other side of that window eventually. And when his time came, when he found himself looking back through the glass at a world that continued without him, he hoped someone would be there to see him, to hear him, to help him finish whatever business he'd left undone. Someone like him, someone who paid attention, someone who understood that the dead weren't always as gone as they seemed. Elias Hargrave had been a crematory operator for 14 years, and in all that time he'd developed an intimate understanding of heat. Not just the scientific properties of combustion and thermal transfer, but the way heat felt, the way it moved through space, the way it lingered in materials long after the source was removed. He could tell you exactly how long it took for the retort chamber to cool from 2,000 degrees to safe handling temperature. He could estimate within 5 minutes how long a particular body would take to cremate based on size and density. And he could tell you with absolute certainty that cremated remains in a sealed container should cool to room temperature within 2 hours of being removed from the processing unit. That's why the urn on his desk made no sense. He'd delivered it to the family 6 hours ago, completed the transfer of ashes from the temporary container to the bronze vessel they'd selected, sealed it with the threaded lid, wiped it clean, and handed it to the widow with his practiced words of sympathy. She'd accepted it with trembling hands, held it against her chest, and left with her daughter supporting her elbow. Standard procedure, completed dozens of times, nothing unusual. But when Elias had returned to his office after cleaning the retort chamber for the next day's cremations, he'd found the urn sitting on his desk. At first, he'd thought the widow had come back, had changed her mind about something, had left it there while she went to speak with the funeral director about arrangements. But the office door had been locked. He always locked it when he left, a habit formed from years of working with the sensitive materials and confidential records. No one could have gotten in without a key. and only 3 people had keys: himself, the funeral director, and the facility manager. He'd checked with both of them. Neither had been in his office. Neither had seen the widow return. Elias picked up the urn carefully, feeling its weight. Definitely full. He could tell by the distribution, the way the mass settled in his hands. This was the urn he'd given to the widow. He was certain of it. The same bronze finish, the same decorative band around the middle, the same engraving on the base. Thomas Edward Crane, beloved husband and father. But how had it gotten back into his office? And more importantly, why was it warm? Not just warm, hot. Hot enough that he had to set it back down on the desk after a few seconds. Hot enough that his palms were pink where they'd made contact. He stared at it, his mind cycling through explanations. Maybe he'd delivered a different urn to the family. Maybe this one had been sitting on the desk all along and he'd simply forgotten about it. But that didn't make sense. He never forgot. His record-keeping was meticulous, had to be, because the consequences of mixing up remains were catastrophic. 1 body, 1 cremation, 1 container. That was the rule, and he never broke it. He checked his logbook. 1 cremation that morning. Thomas Edward Crane, age 63, cardiac arrest. Cremation completed at 9:47 a.m., remains processed and transferred to family urn at 2:15 p.m., delivered to widow at 2:30 p.m. Everything documented, everything in order. There should be no urn in his office. The ashes of Thomas Crane should be with his widow, probably placed on a mantel or a shelf somewhere, beginning the process of becoming a memorial rather than a person. Elias grabbed a kitchen thermometer from the supply cabinet, the kind he used to check the temperature of refrigeration units in cold storage. He held it near the urn's surface, not quite touching. The digital readout climbed. 90 degrees, 100, 110, 120. At 134 degrees, it stabilized. He pulled the thermometer back and stared at the reading. That was impossible. Cremated remains in a sealed container didn't stay hot for 6 hours. They cooled. They equalized with ambient temperature. That was basic thermodynamics. He called the funeral director, explained the situation. The funeral director sounded confused, asked if Elias was sure about the delivery, suggested that maybe there had been some kind of mix-up. But there couldn't have been a mix-up. Elias had been alone in the facility all day. 1 body in, 1 set of remains out. Mathematics didn't get simpler than that. The funeral director said he'd call the widow, verify that she had the urn, make sure everything was in order. He told Elias to sit tight, not to touch anything until they figured out what was happening. 20 minutes later, the funeral director called back. He sounded shaken. The widow confirmed she had the urn, confirmed it was sealed, confirmed she hadn't left the house since returning home. She'd placed it on the mantel in her living room, exactly where her husband had wanted his ashes to rest. The funeral director had asked her to check the engraving. Thomas Edward Crane, beloved husband and father. Exactly right. So either the widow was confused, or there were somehow 2 urns with identical engravings containing identical remains. Both scenarios were impossible. Elias hung up and looked at the urn on his desk. It sat there, bronze and gleaming, radiating heat like it contained something alive, something burning. He reached out slowly, intending to test the temperature again, and the moment his fingers touched the metal surface, he felt it. A vibration, subtle, barely perceptible, but definitely there. The urn was vibrating, a low, steady pulse that traveled up through his fingertips into his hand. He jerked his hand back and stood up, backing away from the desk. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. Cremated remains didn't generate heat. They didn't vibrate. They didn't appear in locked rooms after being delivered to families. There was no rational explanation for what he was experiencing, which meant either his senses were lying to him or something impossible was happening. Neither option brought him any comfort. He left the office, locked the door behind him, and went to the cremation chamber. The retort was cold now, had been cold for hours. He'd cleaned it thoroughly after completing Thomas Crane's cremation, had removed every trace of ash and bone fragment, had prepared it for tomorrow's work. But standing there in front of the massive steel door, he felt compelled to check again, to make absolutely certain that nothing had been left behind, that he hadn't somehow made a mistake that would explain the impossible urn in his office. He opened the observation window and peered inside. The chamber was dark, empty, exactly as he'd left it. The refractory brick lining showed no signs of residue. The loading track was clean. Everything was in order. He closed the window and walked back to his office, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he unlocked the door and looked at his desk, his breath caught in his throat. The urn had moved. Not a lot, maybe 3 inches to the left, but it had definitely moved. He'd left it centered on the desk, positioned carefully, and now it sat off-center, closer to the edge. He approached slowly, watching it, waiting for it to move again. It remained still, but the heat radiating from it had increased. He could feel it from 3 feet away, could feel the warmth on his face like standing too close to a fire. Elias grabbed his phone and took photographs. Multiple angles, close-ups of the engraving, wide shots showing the urn's position on the desk. He needed documentation, needed evidence that this was really happening, that he wasn't losing his mind. The photographs looked normal, showed exactly what he was seeing. A bronze urn sitting on a desk in a small office. Nothing in the images suggested anything unusual, anything impossible. Just an ordinary urn that happened to be inexplicably hot and inexplicably present in a locked room. He called the facility manager, explained everything that had happened. The manager listened without interrupting, and when Elias finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, the manager spoke. He said that sometimes grief did strange things to people, made them see things that weren't there, made them remember events differently than they'd actually happened. He suggested that Elias might be experiencing stress, might need to take a few days off, might benefit from talking to someone. He didn't say counselor or therapist, but Elias heard the implication clearly enough. Elias thanked him and hung up. He wasn't stressed, he wasn't seeing things. The urn was real, was sitting on his desk right now, was hot enough to burn skin if held too long. This was happening, regardless of whether anyone believed him. He sat down at his desk, as far from the urn as the small office allowed, and he tried to think rationally about the situation. What did he actually know? 1. He'd cremated Thomas Crane that morning, following all procedures correctly. 2. He'd delivered the ashes to the widow at 2:30 p.m. 3. The urn had appeared in his locked office sometime in the 6 hours since. 4. The widow confirmed she still had the urn, had it in her possession, had never left her house. That meant either the widow was lying, which seemed unlikely given her genuine grief and confusion, or there were 2 urns. And if there were 2 urns, then either Elias had somehow created duplicate ashes, which was physically impossible, or something else was going on. Something that existed outside the normal rules of physics and logic and everything he understood about the world. He looked at the urn again. In the dim light of the office, he could swear it was glowing slightly, a faint, orange luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with the vibration he'd felt earlier. He closed his eyes, counted to 10, opened them again. The glow was still there, subtle but unmistakable. The urn was not just hot. It was burning somehow from the inside, as if the ashes contained within still held the heat of the cremation fire, still held the energy of the body that had been reduced to ash and bone. Elias made a decision. He would take the urn home with him. He would monitor it overnight, document any changes, and in the morning he would figure out what to do next. Maybe call a physicist or a materials scientist, someone who could explain thermal retention in cremated remains. Maybe call a priest, though he hadn't been to church since childhood and wouldn't know what to say. Maybe just throw the whole thing in the river and pretend it had never happened. But for now, he would take it home, would keep it close, would watch it and wait to see what it wanted, because he was becoming increasingly certain that it wanted something. He found a canvas bag in the supply closet, lined it with a thick towel, and carefully placed the urn inside. Even through the towel and the canvas, he could feel the heat. He carried it to his truck, set it gently on the passenger seat, and drove home through the early evening traffic. The whole way, he kept glancing at the bag, expecting to see smoke or flames, expecting the heat to intensify until the urn melted through the fabric and burned through the seat. But nothing changed. The heat remained constant, steady, a reminder that something impossible was happening and he was carrying it home with him. His house was small, a 2-bedroom rental on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy but adequate for a man who lived alone and spent most of his time at work. He brought the urn inside and set it on the kitchen table. The bag was warm to the touch but not burning. He carefully removed the urn, set it on a ceramic trivet usually reserved for hot pots, and stepped back. It sat there, bronze and gleaming, radiating heat into the cool evening air. Elias made dinner, or tried to. He kept looking at the urn, kept feeling its presence in the room like a third person had joined him for the meal. He eventually gave up on eating, scraped his plate into the trash, and poured himself a whiskey instead. He sat at the table, the glass in one hand, staring at the urn, trying to understand what it wanted from him. Because it wanted something. He was certain of that now. Urns didn't appear in locked offices on their own. Ashes didn't stay hot for hours. This was intentional, purposeful, a message of some kind that he was too dense or too frightened to understand. He reached out and touched the urn again, placing his palm flat against the bronze surface despite the heat. It burned, but he didn't pull away. He held his hand there, feeling the vibration, feeling the pulse of whatever energy was trapped inside. And as he sat there, his palm burning, his mind blank with pain and confusion, he heard something. A sound, faint and distant, coming from inside the urn. A voice, or something like a voice, speaking words he couldn't quite make out. He pulled his hand back, his palm red and angry. The sound continued, a low murmur, rhythmic and repetitive, like a chant or a prayer. He leaned closer, pressing his ear near the urn's surface, trying to hear clearly. The words were still indistinct, muffled by the metal and by something else, some quality of the voice itself that made it hard to process. But he could hear the urgency in it, the desperation. Whatever was speaking wanted to be heard, needed to communicate something important. Elias stood up, walked away from the table, poured another whiskey. This was insane. Urns didn't speak. Dead people didn't communicate through their ashes. There was no mechanism for this, no explanation that didn't involve either severe mental breakdown on his part or a complete revision of everything science understood about death and consciousness. He drank the whiskey quickly, felt the burn in his throat, welcomed the distraction from the impossible thing sitting on his kitchen table. At midnight, he gave up on sleep and returned to the kitchen. The urn was still there, still hot, still vibrating slightly. The voice had stopped, or maybe he'd just stopped being able to hear it. He couldn't tell anymore. Everything felt unreal, dreamlike, as if he'd somehow slipped sideways into a different version of his life where the rules were different, where the dead didn't stay quiet, where ashes burned forever. He grabbed a notebook and pen from the drawer and started writing. Everything that had happened, every detail he could remember, from the moment he'd found the urn in his office to now. He wrote for an hour, filling pages with observations and theories and questions that had no answers. When he finished, he read through what he'd written, and one detail jumped out at him. The widow had said she placed the urn on the mantel exactly where her husband had wanted his ashes to rest. Wanted. Past tense. Thomas Crane had expressed a preference about where his remains should be kept. Elias opened his laptop and searched for Thomas Crane's obituary. It was easy to find, published in the local newspaper 3 days ago. Thomas Edward Crane, 63, died suddenly of cardiac arrest on October 23rd. Survived by his wife Margaret and daughter Claire. Remembered as a devoted husband, loving father, and dedicated volunteer at St. Joseph's Church. In lieu of flowers, donations can be made to the church's food pantry. Services held at Pine Haven Memorial, cremation to follow. Nothing unusual, nothing that explained what was happening. But at the bottom of the obituary, there was a quote attributed to Thomas himself. Something he'd apparently said often during his life. "When I'm gone, don't keep me locked up. Let me go where I can see the sky." Elias read the quote 3 times, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. Let me go where I can see the sky, not on a mantel in a living room, not sealed in an urn in a house, outside. Thomas Crane had wanted his ashes scattered, wanted to be released, wanted to be free. But his widow had brought him home instead, had placed him on the mantel, had kept him locked inside bronze and thread and grief. And somehow, impossibly, Thomas Crane was objecting. He was burning, vibrating, appearing in places he shouldn't be, trying to communicate the only way he could, trying to tell someone, anyone, that this wasn't what he wanted, that he needed to be released, that being kept was worse than being dead. Elias looked at the urn on his kitchen table, and suddenly everything made a kind of terrible sense. The heat was rage, or frustration, or desperation. The vibration was movement, the futile attempt of something trapped to escape. The voice was exactly what it sounded like, a plea for help from someone who had no other way to ask. Thomas Crane wasn't at peace. Thomas Crane was still aware, still conscious on some level, still experiencing existence in a way that should have been impossible but apparently wasn't. And he was suffering. At 1 a.m, Elias made a decision. He grabbed the urn, wrapped it carefully in the towel, and carried it to his truck. He drove through the empty streets, out past the suburbs, out to the state park where trails wound through hills and valleys and eventually led to an overlook that faced east. Perfect for watching the sunrise. He parked in the empty lot, took the urn, and walked. The trail was dark, lit only by his phone's flashlight, but he knew it well enough. He'd hiked it dozens of times, always alone, always early in the morning before work, back when he'd still believed in exercise and fresh air and the healing properties of nature. He climbed steadily, the urn growing heavier with each step, the heat seeping through the towel and warming his hands. By the time he reached the overlook, his arms ached and his breath came in short gasps. He set the urn down on the flat rock that marked the best viewing spot and unscrewed the lid. Inside, the ashes looked normal. Gray and white fragments, the processed remains of a human body reduced to its most basic components. But when he tilted the urn, when he let the ashes pour out into the wind, he felt it. A release, sudden and complete, like a held breath finally exhaled. The heat vanished. The vibration stopped. And for just a moment, in the darkness before dawn, Elias could swear he saw something rise from the ashes, something translucent and barely visible, something that looked almost like a human figure standing at the edge of the overlook, arms raised to the sky. Then it was gone, the ashes scattered on the wind, carried away into the darkness, spread across the hills and valleys below. The urn sat empty in his hands, cool to the touch now, just bronze and threads and empty space where a man's remains had been contained against his will. Elias stood there until dawn broke over the eastern horizon, watching the sky turn from black to gray to pink to gold. When the sun was fully up, he walked back to his truck, drove home, and placed the empty urn in his garage. That morning, he called the facility and told them he was taking a sick day. Then he called the widow, Margaret Crane, and told her something that was both a lie and a truth, that there had been a minor issue with the cremation process, nothing serious, but he needed to replace her urn as a precaution. He would deliver a new one that afternoon, no charge, with his sincerest apologies for any inconvenience. She accepted, confused but agreeable, and thanked him for his diligence. Elias went to the funeral supply warehouse and purchased an identical urn, same bronze finish, same decorative band, same everything. He had it engraved with Thomas Crane's name and dates. Then he went back to the state park, walked to the overlook, and collected ashes. Not human ashes, just wood ash from an old fire pit that campers had used, mixed with fine sand and small fragments of stone. He processed it carefully, made it look right, made it weigh approximately what cremated remains should weigh. Then he placed it in the new urn, sealed it, and delivered it to Margaret Crane. She accepted it with tears in her eyes, thanked him again, placed it back on the mantel where she'd kept the first one. Elias left quickly, drove home, and spent the rest of the day sitting in his garage, staring at the empty urn that had started this whole nightmare. It sat on his workbench, innocent and inert, just a bronze container that had once held ashes. No heat, no vibration, no voice. Whatever had been trapped inside was gone now, released, free to go wherever it was the dead went when they finally let go. But Elias couldn't let it go. He kept thinking about Thomas Crane, about the consciousness that had somehow persisted after death, that had remained aware and trapped and desperate. He kept thinking about the quote from the obituary, "Don't keep me locked up." How many other bodies had he cremated over the years whose families had ignored their wishes? How many urns sat on mantels and shelves and in mausoleums, containing remains that wanted to be scattered but were kept locked away by people who couldn't bear to let go? He started paying more attention to the obituaries, reading them carefully, noting what each deceased person had wanted for their remains. And whenever he saw someone who'd requested scattering but whose family had chosen retention, he felt a cold weight in his stomach, wondering if somewhere in that house, an urn was burning, vibrating, trying desperately to communicate a message no one wanted to hear. 3 weeks after the incident with Thomas Crane, another urn appeared on Elias's desk. He found it in the morning when he arrived for work, sitting exactly where the first one had been, radiating heat that made the air shimmer. This one was for Dorothy Simmons, age 76, cremated 2 weeks ago. He checked his records. The family had taken the urn home, had declined scattering despite Dorothy's written request to have her ashes spread over the lake where she'd spent her summers as a child. Elias didn't hesitate this time. He took the urn, drove to the lake, and released the ashes into the water. He watched them float for a moment before sinking, dispersing, becoming part of the ecosystem Dorothy had loved. And he felt that same sense of release, that same exhalation of held breath, that same momentary glimpse of something translucent rising and dissolving into air. It happened again a month later, and again 2 months after that. Always the same pattern. Cremation completed, family taking the urn home despite the deceased's request for scattering, urn appearing on Elias's desk days or weeks later, burning with impossible heat, and always the same solution. Take the urn, go to the place the deceased had wanted, release the ashes, feel the relief of a trapped consciousness finally freed. Elias stopped questioning it, stopped trying to understand the mechanism or the physics or the rules that governed this impossible thing. He just accepted it as part of his job, another duty alongside operating the retort and maintaining records and treating the dead with dignity. He became their advocate, their agent of release, the person who heard their desperate pleas and acted on them when no one else would listen. He kept the empty urns in his garage, lined up on shelves like trophies or memorials. 23 of them now, 23 people who'd been trapped and were now free. Sometimes he'd go out there late at night and look at them. Bronze and ceramic and wood, all empty, all cool to the touch. And he'd remember each one, remember the heat and the vibration and the voice. Remember the moment of release when the ashes scattered and the consciousness finally let go. He never told anyone about it. What would be the point? No one would believe him. They'd think he was disturbed, that the isolation of his work had broken something in his mind, that he needed help. Maybe they'd be right. Maybe he was disturbed. But he'd seen what he'd seen, felt what he'd felt. The dead weren't always as gone as people wanted to believe. Sometimes they remained, trapped in the ashes that had once been their flesh, aware and suffering and desperate for release. And Elias Hargreave had become the person who freed them, not because he understood how or why it was possible, not because he had any special gift or calling, simply because he'd been paying attention the day Thomas Crane's urn had appeared on his desk, burning with the rage of a man denied his final wish. Simply because he'd had the courage to listen to a voice that shouldn't exist, speaking from ashes that shouldn't burn. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because the urns kept appearing, and the dead kept calling out, and someone had to answer. Someone had to free them. Someone had to stand at the edge of an overlook or a lake or an ocean and pour out the ashes and watch them scatter on the wind, carrying with them the last fragments of consciousness, the last desperate wishes of people who'd already lost everything else. Caspar Llewellyn had worked alone at Moorfield Crematorium for 9 years, and in that time he'd developed a deep appreciation for routine. The same actions performed in the same order at the same time created a rhythm that made the work bearable, made the hours pass without the weight of what he was actually doing pressing too heavily on his mind. Every morning at 7 he'd arrive, unlock the facility, check the retort chamber, review the day's schedule. Every evening at 6 he'd complete the final cremation, clean the chamber, secure the building, and go home. 9 years of this pattern had worn grooves into his life so deep he could navigate them half asleep. The retort door was part of that routine. After each cremation, after the remains had cooled enough to remove, after he'd raked them onto the processing tray and transferred them to the cremulator, he would clean the chamber thoroughly. Then he'd close the heavy steel door, engage the locking mechanism with its satisfying metallic click, and move on to the next task. The door was designed to stay closed, to contain heat and prevent accidents, to keep the chamber sealed until it was needed again. In 9 years, it had never failed to do its job, until Tuesday. Caspar completed the day's final cremation at 5:40, a routine procedure for a woman who'd died of natural causes at 83. He cleaned the chamber, sealed the door, heard the lock click into place, and went to his office to complete the paperwork. When he returned to the retort room 30 minutes later to do his final check before leaving, the door was open. Not slightly ajar, not cracked an inch. Fully open, swung wide, the chamber dark and empty beyond it. He stood in the doorway, staring at the open door, running through possibilities. Had he forgotten to engage the lock? Impossible. He'd heard the click, had tested the handle to make sure it was secure. Had someone else entered the facility? The building was locked. He was the only one with keys at this hour. Had the locking mechanism failed? He walked to the door and examined it closely. The lock was intact, showed no signs of damage or wear. The door hinges were solid, properly mounted, functioning normally. Casper closed the door again, this time paying meticulous attention to every detail. He pushed it shut, felt the seal engage, turned the locking handle clockwise until it stopped. Tested the door by pulling on the handle. Locked, secure, exactly as it should be. He stepped back, watching it for a full minute, waiting to see if it would somehow open on its own. It remained closed. He shook his head, decided he was more tired than he'd realized, and left for the day. Wednesday morning, 7 a.m., he unlocked the facility and went straight to the retort room. The door was open again. Wide open, exactly as he'd found it the previous evening. The chamber was cold, untouched, empty. But the door that he'd locked 12 hours ago stood open like a mouth waiting to be fed. Casper felt something cold settle in his stomach, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years of working with the dead. Unease. Not quite fear, but its cousin. He closed the door, locked it, and this time he took a photograph with his phone. Time-stamped, showing the closed and secured door. Then he went about his day's work, 3 cremations scheduled, all routine. Between each one, he returned to check the door. After the first cremation at 9:30, the door was open. After the second at noon, open. After the third at 3, open. Each time he'd close it, lock it, photograph it. Each time, within an hour or two, he'd return to find it standing open. By Thursday, Casper had stopped trying to understand why. He focused instead on documenting when. He set up a simple system: close and lock the door, note the time, return every 30 minutes, record the door's state. The pattern that emerged made no sense. Sometimes the door would stay closed for 2 hours. Sometimes it would be open after 20 minutes. There was no consistency, no predictable interval. It was as if something was opening it randomly, or perhaps opening it whenever it felt like being opened, which was a thought Casper tried very hard not to pursue. Friday brought a new development. Casper was in his office at 10 a.m., halfway through updating records, when he heard a sound from the retort room. A metallic sound, rhythmic and deliberate. Clang. Pause. Clang. Pause. Clang. He walked down the hallway, the sound growing louder as he approached. When he entered the retort room, the door was open as usual. But now he could pinpoint the sound's source. It was coming from inside the chamber. Someone, or something, was striking metal against metal in a steady measured pattern. He grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the chamber. Empty. The refractory brick walls showed no signs of disturbance. The metal loading track was bare. There was nothing inside that could be making the sound. But the sound continued. Clang. Pause. Clang. Pause. Clang. Always the same interval. Always the same tone. Casper stood at the threshold, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and he listened. The sound wasn't random. It had intention, had rhythm. It was almost like someone tapping out a message in a code he didn't understand. He counted the intervals. 3 seconds between each strike. He counted the strikes. 7, then a longer pause, then 7 again, then another pause. 7 strikes, 7 strikes, 7 strikes. A pattern, repeating. Consistent, deliberate. Casper felt the hair on his arms stand up. This wasn't mechanical failure. This wasn't the building settling or the metal expanding with temperature changes. This was communication. Something inside the chamber was trying to tell him something. Against every instinct, he stepped into the chamber. The space was large enough to stand in when cool, about 8 feet deep and 4 feet wide, He walked forward slowly, his flashlight beam sweeping the walls, looking for the source of the sound. The striking continued, seemed to come from all around him, echoing off the brick surfaces. He reached the back wall and pressed his hand against it. The brick was cool, solid. He could feel the vibration of each strike traveling through the material, could feel it in his palm like a pulse. He pulled his hand back and saw something that made his breath catch. On the wall, at chest height, there was a mark, a handprint, dark against the light-colored brick, fingers spread wide, but not burned into the surface the way organic material would mark the brick during cremation. This print was raised, as if someone had pressed their hand against wet brick and left an impression. Casper touched it carefully, felt the ridges of the fingerprints, the distinct pattern of a human hand. His human hand. The proportions matched his own perfectly. He stumbled backward out of the chamber, his heart hammering. He hadn't touched that wall. He'd never pressed his hand against the back wall of the retort. In 9 years of working here, he'd never had reason to. The mark shouldn't exist. But it was there, clear and undeniable, his handprint in raised relief on brick that should be smooth. He grabbed his phone and took photographs, multiple angles, close-ups showing the detail of the fingerprints. Then he closed the door, locked it, and went to his office. He sat at his desk, staring at the photographs, trying to construct a rational explanation. Maybe the print had always been there and he'd never noticed. Maybe a previous worker had left it years ago, someone with similar-sized hands. Maybe it was a trick of light and shadow, a natural formation in the brick that only looked like a handprint. But none of these explanations felt right. The print was too clear, too perfect, too exactly matched to his own hand. And it hadn't been there yesterday. He was certain of that. The metallic striking stopped around noon, and Casper forced himself to eat lunch, to maintain some semblance of normalcy. He had 2 cremations scheduled for the afternoon, and the work had to continue regardless of impossible handprints and doors that wouldn't stay closed. But when he went to the retort room to prepare for the first cremation, he found something new. The door was open, as expected, but now there were marks on the floor leading to the chamber. Footprints, or the suggestion of footprints. Dark impressions on the tile floor. The pattern was clear. Someone walking from the hallway to the chamber, entering it, not coming back out. Casper followed the prints with his eyes, counting them. 14 impressions, 7 for each foot, leading directly into the chamber and stopping at the threshold. The prints were the right size, matched his work boots. He looked down at his feet, then back at the prints. The tread pattern was identical. These were his footprints, or prints made by his boots, but he hadn't walked into the chamber that morning. He'd been in his office since finishing his inspection. He completed the afternoon cremations mechanically, his mind elsewhere. After securing the second body in the chamber and activating the retort, he sat in the observation area and watched through the small window. The fire consumed the body in its usual manner. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested any abnormality in the process. But his attention kept drifting to that handprint on the back wall, visible now in the glow of the flames, and to the door that he knew, with absolute certainty, would be standing open when he returned tomorrow morning. That night, Casper made a decision. He would stay at the facility overnight, would watch the door continuously, would catch whatever was opening it in the act. He told himself it was about understanding, about finding the rational explanation he knew had to exist. But really, it was about the fear that had been building since Tuesday. The fear that something impossible was happening, and he was somehow at the center of it. He needed to know, needed to see. He prepared for the long night. Coffee, snacks, a chair positioned in the doorway of the retort room with a clear view of the door. He closed and locked the door at 8 p.m., photographed it, noted the time, and settled in to watch. The building was quiet around him, just the usual sounds of an old structure settling, the HVAC system running, the distant hum of refrigeration units in cold storage. Normal sounds. Familiar sounds. Sounds that should have been comforting but somehow weren't. At 9:15, the metallic striking started again. Clang. Pause. Clang. Pause. Clang. The same rhythm as before, 7 strikes. Pause. 7 strikes. Pause. Casper stood up, approached the door. It was still closed, still locked. But the sound was definitely coming from inside the chamber, clear and distinct. He pressed his ear against the door, listening. The strikes were loud now, immediate, like someone was directly on the other side of the door, striking it with a metal rod or a tool. Without thinking, he began tapping back. He used his knuckles, struck the door 3 times, paused, struck 3 times again. The striking inside stopped. Silence filled the room, heavy and expectant. Then it started again, but different this time. 3 strikes, pause, 3 strikes, pause, mirroring what he'd done. Casper felt a chill run through him. Whatever was inside the chamber was responding, was communicating, was aware that he was out here listening. He tapped 4 times. The response came immediately. 4 strikes. He tapped twice, 2 strikes back. He tapped a complex pattern. 5 quick strikes, pause, 2 strikes, pause, 3 strikes. The pattern was repeated exactly from inside the chamber. It was learning his rhythm, matching him, following him. Or perhaps it had always known his rhythm, had always known him, and was just now choosing to reveal itself. Casper stepped back from the door, his hands shaking. This was impossible. There was nothing alive inside that chamber. Nothing that could hear him, nothing that could respond. The chamber was empty, was always empty between cremations. He'd checked it himself before closing the door. But something was in there, something that could strike metal and listen and respond. Something that knew his rhythms and his patterns and his handprint. At midnight, the door opened. Casper was sitting in his chair, watching, his eyes focused on the door handle. He saw it turn, saw the lock disengage, saw the door swing slowly open. There was no one near it, no hand on the handle, no visible mechanism causing the movement. It simply opened, smooth and deliberate, as if pulled by an invisible force, and from inside the chamber, he heard a new sound. Breathing. Slow, steady, the rhythm of someone sleeping or resting. In and out, in and out. He stood up, grabbed his flashlight, and approached the chamber carefully. The breathing continued, unchanged by his movement. He reached the threshold and shone his light inside. Empty, nothing there but brick walls and metal tracks, and that handprint on the back wall. But the breathing continued, seemed to fill the space, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing, and walked to the back wall. He placed his hand over the raised handprint, matching it exactly, his palm pressed against the cold brick. The breathing stopped, and Casper felt something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. A presence, immediate and overwhelming, like someone standing directly behind him. He could feel breath on the back of his neck, could feel the heat of another body in the cold chamber. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The chamber was empty. He was alone. But the feeling didn't fade. The presence remained, close and watchful. He walked backward out of the chamber, not turning his back on it, not breaking eye contact with the darkness inside. When he reached the door, he grabbed the handle and pulled it closed. The lock engaged automatically. He stood there, breathing hard, his hand still on the handle. From inside, the metallic striking started again. But this time it wasn't 7 strikes. It was continuous, frantic, desperate. Strike after strike after strike, faster and louder, like someone trying to break through the door, trying to get out. Casper ran. He left the retort room, went to his office, locked the door, and sat in his chair with his head in his hands. The striking continued for 20 minutes, echoing through the building, then stopped abruptly. Silence returned, absolute and oppressive. Casper sat there until dawn, not sleeping, not moving, just listening to the silence and thinking about the handprint and the breathing and the presence that had stood behind him in the chamber. When morning came, he unlocked his office door and walked to the retort room. The door was open, as he knew it would be. He approached slowly, looked inside. The handprint on the back wall was gone. The brick was smooth, unmarked, exactly as it should be. But now there was something new. On the loading track, centered perfectly, was a small object. Casper picked it up carefully, examined it in the light. It was a key, old and tarnished, the kind that might fit an antique lock. There was no tag, no label, nothing to indicate what it belonged to. He searched the facility, trying locks at random, knowing it was futile. The key was too old, too ornate to fit any modern lock in the building. But he tried anyway, tried every door, every cabinet, every storage closet. Nothing. The key belonged to something that wasn't here, to a lock that didn't exist, or a lock that had existed once, long ago, before this building was a crematorium, before it was anything at all. Casper stopped fighting the door after that day. He let it stand open when it wanted to be open, closed it when he needed to use the retort, never locked it. The striking continued occasionally, always the same pattern. 7 strikes, pause, 7 strikes. He stopped responding to it, stopped trying to communicate. He completed his work, performed his cremations, maintained his routine. But the chamber felt different now, felt occupied somehow, even when empty. On the first anniversary of the door refusing to stay closed, Casper found another handprint. This one was on the chamber floor, palm down, fingers spread. His hand again, perfect proportions but facing a direction he never would have placed it, as if someone had fallen, had caught themselves, had left this mark as evidence of their presence. He photographed it, added it to the growing collection of images on his phone. Evidence of something he couldn't explain, happening for reasons he couldn't understand. The door opens and closes now according to its own schedule. Some days it stays closed all day. Other days it won't stay shut for more than an hour. Casper has learned to work around it, has learned to accept it as part of his routine. The dead pass through his retort, are reduced to ash, are collected and delivered to families. And the door opens and closes, marking time in a rhythm only it understands. And sometimes, late in the day when the light is fading and the building is quiet, Casper hears that metallic striking. 7 times, pause, 7 times, a message he'll never decode from a presence that has no name, trapped in a chamber that won't stay sealed, desperate to communicate the only way it knows how. Grady Whitlock had been the night intake coordinator at Silverton Crematorium for 6 years, a job that required precision, patience, and an unusual comfort with solitude. His shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., during which time he received bodies from hospitals, nursing homes, and the occasional coroner's transport. Each body arrived with documentation, a death certificate, a transport form, and most importantly, a cremation authorization tag. The tag was a simple piece of cardstock with a unique identification number, the deceased's name, date of death, and the funeral home handling arrangements. Grady's job was to verify each tag against the paperwork, log the body into the system, assign it a storage location, and prepare it for cremation the following day. The system was foolproof. had been refined over decades to prevent the nightmare scenario that haunted every crematorium operator. Mixing up remains, delivering the wrong ashes to the wrong family. One body, one tag, one cremation, one container. The math was simple and absolute. In 6 years, Grady had never made an error, had never lost a tag, had never questioned the system, until the night he counted 5 tags when there should have been 4. It was a Tuesday in mid-April, unusually warm for the season, the kind of night where the air felt thick and the building's air conditioning struggled to maintain temperature. Grady had received 4 bodies that shift, 2 from County Hospital, 1 from Restview Nursing Home, and 1 from a private residence via coroner transport. All standard procedures, all properly documented. He'd logged them in, assigned them to refrigerated storage units A through D, and filed their paperwork in the intake binder. At 4 a.m., during his routine check before the morning crew arrived, he walked through the storage area with his clipboard, verifying that each tag matched his log. Storage Unit A, Eleanor Voss, 81, natural causes. Tag present and correct. Storage Unit B, Marcus Chen, 73, cardiac arrest. Tag present and correct. Storage Unit C, Patricia Dalton, 67, respiratory failure. Tag present and correct. Storage Unit D, William Storrow, 59, industrial accident. Tag present and correct. 4 bodies, 4 tags, everything in order. But when Grady turned to leave, he saw it. On the counter beside the intake desk, lying flat as if someone had just placed it there, was a 5th tag. He picked it up slowly, his mind already cycling through explanations. Had one of the tags come loose from a body? Had he somehow logged in 5 bodies instead of 4 and forgotten one? He checked the tag's information. There was no name, no identification number, no funeral home listed. The only marking was a date, handwritten in faded blue ink. April 19th, 1987. Nothing else. Just that date, precise and clear on an otherwise blank tag. Grady checked his logbook. 4 bodies received, 4 logged in. He checked the storage units again, physically opening each door and verifying the tags attached to the body bags. All 4 were accounted for, properly labeled, exactly where they should be. The 5th tag had no corresponding body. It was an orphan, a piece of paper that shouldn't exist, marked with a date from 38 years ago. He turned it over, looking for additional information. The back was blank except for a small symbol in the corner, barely visible. It looked like a triangle with a circle inside it, drawn in the same faded blue ink as the date. He took the tag to his office and searched the crematorium's records. The filing system went back 40 years, meticulously maintained first on paper and later digitized. He searched for April 19, 1987, looking for any cremations performed on that date. The database returned 3 results: Martha Quincy, James DiNardo, and Robert Halsworth. All routine cremations, all properly documented, all completed and closed with no irregularities noted. He printed out their records and compared them to the mystery tag. Nothing matched. The symbol on the tag appeared nowhere in their documentation. Grady set the tag aside and tried to focus on his remaining duties, but his eyes kept drifting back to it, to that date written in fading ink. April 19th, 1987. Something significant had happened that day, something important enough that someone had created this tag and marked it with that specific date. But what? And why had it appeared now, 38 years later, on a night when he was alone in the building with 4 bodies and no answers? At 6 a.m., the morning crew arrived. Grady showed the tag to his supervisor, explained how he'd found it on the counter. The supervisor examined it, frowned, and suggested it was probably from an old batch of tags that had been stored somewhere and accidentally dropped. "Just throw it away," he said. It's not connected to anything. But Grady didn't throw it away. He slipped it into his pocket and took it home, unable to shake the feeling that the tag had appeared for a reason, that it was trying to tell him something important. That night, when he returned for his shift, he found the tag again. Not in his pocket where he'd left it at home, but on the counter in the exact same spot where he'd found it the first time. Lying flat, date facing up, waiting. Grady stood there, staring at it, his hand still on the door he'd just locked behind him. He'd left the tag at home. He was certain of it. He'd placed it in his desk drawer, had closed the drawer, had left his house and driven to work. But here it was, back at the crematorium in the exact position it had been 12 hours ago. He picked it up with trembling fingers and compared it to the one he thought he'd left at home. Identical. Same cardstock, same faded ink, same date, same symbol. Either he'd somehow brought it with him without realizing, or there were two tags, or something impossible was happening. He pulled out his phone and called his wife, asked her to check his desk drawer. She did, and her voice came back confused. "Yes," she said, "there's a tag here." Old-looking, with a date written on it. April 19th, 1987. Grady thanked her and hung up. Two tags, both identical, both marked with the same date. One at home, one at the crematorium. He sat down at his desk and tried to think rationally. Someone was playing a prank, had to be. Someone had access to his house, had seen the tag in his drawer, had created a duplicate and planted it here. But who? And why? And how had they gotten into the crematorium? The building was locked, the security system was armed. Only 4 people had access codes, and none of them had reason to play elaborate pranks. The night proceeded normally until midnight, when Grady did his first storage unit check. 4 bodies, 4 tags, all accounted for. But on the counter, next to where the mystery tag had been lying, he found 2 more tags. Both blank, except for dates. April 19th, 1987, and April 19th, 1987. 3 tags total now, all identical, all impossible. He grabbed them and put them in his pocket along with the first one. Then he searched the building thoroughly, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place where someone might be concealing themselves. Empty. He was alone with 4 bodies and 3 tags that shouldn't exist. At 2 a.m., he found the 4th tag. On his desk, placed carefully on top of his logbook, date facing up. He didn't remember leaving his office, didn't remember leaving the logbook unattended. But there it was, another tag, identical to the others. He added it to his pocket and continued his rounds, checking the storage units, verifying the paperwork, maintaining his routine because routine was all he had left to hold on to. The alternative, accepting that something impossible was happening, was too frightening to consider. At 4 a.m. during his pre-dawn check, he opened storage unit D to verify William Storrow's tag. The body bag was there, properly secured, tag attached to the zipper pull. But now there was something else inside the unit, lying on the shelf beside the bag. Another tag, the 5th one. Grady picked it up with hands that had started shaking an hour ago and hadn't stopped. Same cardstock, same date, same symbol. 5 tags, all identical, appearing throughout the night in places they shouldn't be. He added it to his pocket and closed the storage unit. He returned to his office and laid all 5 tags on his desk, arranging them in the order he'd found them. Counter, 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 desk, storage unit. A pattern, maybe, or a progression. He photographed them, documenting the evidence, creating a record of something he couldn't explain. Then he researched the date again, this time searching beyond the crematorium's records. He looked for news articles from April 19th, 1987, for local events, for anything that might explain why this date was significant. The search returned dozens of results. It was a Sunday, clear weather, no major storms or disasters. But then he found something that made his breath catch. A small article from the back pages of the local newspaper, easy to miss among the larger stories. Crematorium marks grand opening. The article was brief, just 3 paragraphs describing the opening ceremony of Silverton Crematorium on April 19, 1987. Local officials attended, ribbon was cut, facility began operations. The article included a photograph of the building, new and clean, with a small group of people standing in front of it for the ceremony. Grady zoomed in on the photograph, studying the faces. He recognized some of them. The mayor from that era, a city councilman, the funeral home director who'd commissioned the building. But there was one face he didn't recognize. A man standing slightly apart from the main group, positioned near the entrance. The photograph was grainy, printed from an old negative, but Grady could make out certain features. The man was young, maybe late 20s, wearing dark clothes and holding something in his hand. Grady zoomed in further, enhancing the image as much as his phone would allow. The object in the man's hand looked like a clipboard or a folder, and on it, barely visible, was what appeared to be a tag. He searched for more information about the opening ceremony, looking for a list of attendees for employee records from 1987. The crematorium's files were comprehensive, but the earliest digital records only went back to '95. Everything before that existed only on paper, stored in boxes in the basement archive. Grady checked the time, 4:30 a.m. He had 90 minutes before the morning crew arrived. He grabbed his flashlight and went to the basement. The archive was exactly as unpleasant as he'd expected. Dusty, poorly lit, filled with rows of metal shelving holding banker's boxes labeled by year. He found the 1987 boxes and started searching. Personnel files, financial records, maintenance logs, everything meticulously filed and preserved. He found the file for the opening ceremony, pulled it out, and began reading by flashlight. Guest list, program schedule, catering invoice, photographs. And then, near the back of the file, he found something that made his hands stop shaking and his breath stop altogether. It was an incident report dated April 19, 1987, written in careful handwriting on official crematorium letterhead. The report described an accident during the opening ceremony. A man, identified as David Whitlock, had been conducting a demonstration of the retort system for the visiting officials. During the demonstration, while explaining the loading mechanism, he'd leaned too far into the chamber. The door had closed automatically, a safety feature that had been improperly calibrated. By the time they'd gotten it open again, David Whitlock had suffered severe burns and smoke inhalation. He was transported to County Hospital but died 3 hours later. Grady read the name again. David Whitlock. His surname. He checked the report for additional information. David Whitlock, age 28, night intake coordinator, employed since April 1st, 1987. 18 days of employment before his death. The report concluded with a note that David's body had been cremated at his family's request. Services held privately, no further investigation warranted. Accidental death, tragedy, case closed. Grady sat on the basement floor, the file in his lap, trying to process what he'd learned. David Whitlock. Same surname, same job title, same shift. Died in the building where Grady now worked, on the day the building opened. Had to be a relative. Probably a distant one. The Whitlock name wasn't uncommon in the region. Could be a coincidence, a tragic coincidence, but nothing more. Except that the tags kept appearing, kept multiplying, all marked with the date of David's death. That wasn't coincidence. That was a message. He checked his pocket. The 5 tags were still there, along with something new. A sixth tag, identical to the others, that definitely hadn't been there when he'd come down to the basement. 6 tags now, appearing faster, becoming more insistent. Grady stood up, put the file back in the box, and climbed the stairs to the main floor. The building felt different now, felt watched, as if every shadow contained something waiting, something patient. In his office, he searched for David Whitlock's family, looking for any surviving relatives. The trail was cold, most leads decades old, but he eventually found an obituary from 1987. David Whitlock, survived by his wife Sarah and his son, age 3. No names provided for the son. Grady did the math. A 3-year-old in 1987 would be 41 now, roughly his own age. He searched birth records, cross-referencing the Whitlock surname with births in 1984. He found 12 possibilities, narrowed it down by location, and eventually found a name that made his blood run cold. Grady Andrew Whitlock, born May 15, 1984. Parents David and Sarah Whitlock. He sat very still, staring at his own name on the screen. Grady Andrew Whitlock. His name. His birth date. His parents, listed in a document he'd never seen before, connected to a man he'd never heard of who'd died in this building 38 years ago. His father, David Whitlock, had been his father. The man who'd burned in the retort on opening day, the man whose death had been filed away and forgotten, was his father. And Grady had been working in this building, doing the same job, on the same shift, for 6 years without knowing. The implications crashed over him like a wave. His mother had never told him. She'd remarried when he was young. He'd taken his stepfather's name. He'd grown up believing David Whitlock was just a name on a birth certificate, a man who'd left before Grady was old enough to remember. But David hadn't left. David had died here, had burned here, had been cremated here, and somehow, across 38 years, David was reaching out, was using the only language he knew, the language of tags and dates and identification numbers, to communicate with his son. Grady pulled the 6 tags from his pocket and laid them on his desk. April 19, 1987, the date his father died, the date the crematorium opened, the date that connected everything. He looked at the symbol on the back of each tag, that triangle with the circle inside it. He'd seen that symbol before, he realized, not in the crematorium's records, but somewhere else. He pulled out his wallet and found what he was looking for. A photograph of himself as a child, maybe 4 years old, sitting on someone's lap. He'd carried this photograph for years without really looking at it, one of the few images he had from his early childhood. But now he looked closely at the person holding him. A young man with dark hair and kind eyes wearing a shirt with a logo on the pocket. Grady zoomed in on the logo with his phone camera. A triangle with a circle inside it. The same symbol from the tags. He didn't sleep that day. He went home, told his wife he didn't feel well, and spent the hours researching everything he could find about David Whitlock. There wasn't much. A few documents, the obituary, the incident report. But he found photographs. Old family photos his mother had kept in boxes, photos he'd never bothered to look through. David holding infant Grady in the hospital. David pushing toddler Grady on a swing. David teaching Grady to walk, to throw a ball, to smile at the camera. 3 years of memories he'd lost, erased by time, and his mother's silence, and his own willingness to accept the story he'd been told. That night, when he returned to work, he knew what he had to do. He went to the retort room, the chamber where his father had died, and he stood at the threshold. The chamber was cold, empty, cleaned, and prepared for the next day's cremations. He pulled out the 6 tags and held them in his hand, feeling their weight, understanding their meaning. They weren't just tags. They were pieces of his father, fragments of consciousness or memory or will, trying to establish connection across an impossible divide. Grady stepped into the chamber. The space was large enough to stand in, industrial and cold, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. He walked to the center and placed the 6 tags on the floor, arranging them in a circle. Then he sat down in the middle of the circle and waited. The building was quiet around him, just the usual sounds of night. But he felt something else. A presence, patient and watchful, that had been waiting a very long time for someone to listen, for someone to understand. The first unsaid tag appeared at midnight. Not one of the 6 he'd arranged on the floor, but a new one, appearing in his lap as if placed there by invisible hands. He picked it up. April 19th, 1987, he set it down with the others. At 12:30, another tag appeared. Then another at 1. They kept coming, appearing one by one until he was surrounded by dozens of them, all identical, all marked with the same date. The circle grew larger, the tags multiplying, filling the chamber floor in an expanding spiral that seemed to have no end. At 2 a.m., something changed. The tags stopped appearing. The chamber was filled with them now, hundreds of cardstock rectangles marked with his father's death date, arranged in a perfect spiral that led from the edges of the chamber to where Grady sat in the center. And in the silence that followed, he heard it. A voice, faint but distinct, speaking words he'd waited his entire life to hear, even though he hadn't known he was waiting. "I'm sorry I left." The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the tags themselves or from the air or from some space between memory and reality. "I didn't want to leave. I tried to stay. I tried to be there." Grady's eyes filled with tears. He wanted to respond, wanted to tell his father that he understood, that it wasn't his fault, that 38 years of silence didn't matter because they were here now, together in this cold chamber, connected by a spiral of tags and the impossible space between living and dead. But he couldn't speak. His throat was too tight, his grief too large for words. "You're doing my job," the voice continued. "You're here, in my place, doing the work I couldn't finish. I didn't know. I didn't know you'd come here. If I'd known, I would have found another way." Another way to what? Grady wanted to ask. Another way to communicate. Another way to warn him. Another way to prevent whatever was coming. But the voice faded before he could form the question, dissolving back into silence, leaving him alone in the chamber with hundreds of tags and the cold certainty that his father had been trying to tell him something important, something urgent, and he'd missed it. He gathered the tags carefully, collecting them one by one, returning them to his pocket even though he knew his pockets couldn't possibly hold this many. But somehow they fit. Somehow the tags compressed and folded and disappeared into the fabric, defying physics the same way their appearance had defied everything he understood about death and consciousness and the possibility of communication across the ultimate divide. When the morning crew arrived at 6 a.m., they found Grady sitting at his desk, his face pale, his hands shaking, surrounded by paperwork for the 4 bodies that needed to be cremated that day. He told them he wasn't feeling well, needed to go home, needed someone to cover his shift. They agreed, concerned by his appearance, and he left quickly, driving home in the early morning light. He didn't return to Silverton Crematorium. He called the next day and resigned, said he was dealing with a family emergency, thanked them for 6 years of employment, and hung up before they could ask questions. His wife wanted to know what had happened, what had frightened him so badly that he'd quit a job he'd loved. He showed her the tags, the ones that had multiplied in his pockets until he had hundreds of them, all marked with April 19th, 1987. He told her about David Whitlock, about his father dying in the retort on opening day, about the voice he'd heard in the chamber. She held him while he cried, and she didn't tell him he was imagining things, didn't suggest he needed help or rest or medication. She just held him and let him grieve for the father he'd never known and the connection he'd finally made too late. Decades too late. In a chamber where the dead were burned, and memory became ash. The tags stayed in Grady's possession. He kept them in a box in his closet, hundreds of identical cardstock rectangles marked with the date his father died. Sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, he'd take out the box and count them. The number was always different. Sometimes there were more, sometimes fewer. Sometimes they'd rearrange themselves into patterns, spirals, circles, lines that seemed to point toward something he couldn't identify. He'd given up trying to understand. The tags were his inheritance, the only thing his father could give him across 38 years of separation, and he kept them, treasured them, even though they terrified him. Years later, Grady learned that Silverton Crematorium had closed. The building had been sold, converted into office space, the retort chamber dismantled and removed. He drove there one afternoon and walked through the renovated building, looking for traces of what it had been. The chamber was gone, replaced by a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and ergonomic chairs. But he stood in that space, in the place where his father had died and where he'd heard his father's voice one last time, and he whispered an apology for leaving, for running, for not staying to finish whatever conversation they'd started. That night, he checked the box in his closet. Empty. All the tags were gone. Hundreds of them vanished as mysteriously as they'd appeared. In their place was a single item, a photograph he'd never seen before, showing a young man holding a toddler on his lap. David and Grady, smiling at the camera, frozen in a moment of perfect happiness before everything went wrong. On the back of the photograph, written in faded blue ink, was a message. "You were never supposed to be there. I tried to warn you. I'm sorry. I love you." Grady held the photograph and understood. His father hadn't been trying to communicate for his own sake. He'd been trying to protect Grady, trying to warn him away from the crematorium, trying to prevent his son from following the same path that had killed him. The tags weren't messages. They were warnings. Keep away, don't work here, don't make my mistake. And Grady had finally listened, had finally left, had finally broken the pattern that connected them across 3 decades of death and silence. He kept the photograph on his desk after that, a reminder of the father he'd never known, but who'd never stopped watching, never stopped trying to protect him, even from beyond death, even through the impossible medium of endlessly multiplying tags marked with the day everything ended and nothing would ever be right again. And sometimes, when the light caught the photograph at just the right angle, Grady could swear he saw his father smile, relieved and sad, and finally, at peace.